Hey guys, my name is Art, and in this video I resculpt a 3-year-old character and take the project scope way too far again. This is a sculpture that I made about 3 years ago. It was about 3 months after I started sculpting. I made it as a part of a class with the great Simon Lee. I quite like it actually. For all the technical flaws in the piece, something about the design stuck with me. I like the simplicity of the design and how she's just nothing but flames and a single big talon, and I just really like the personality in the piece. And recently, when I wanted to try out a new clay called Bees Putty, spoiler alert, it's a really good one, I didn't want to come up with a new design, so I decided that I'm going to resculpt this fire lady once again. So here we go. I'm starting this as usual with an 1/8" aluminum wire twisted together in the middle, wrapped with some floral wire for texture. Add some clay for the initial skeleton to make sure my proportions are right, followed by some simplified muscle buildup, and before you know it, we got something posable. I want to use the old sculpture basically as a design prompt. In my previous version, she's drinking a droplet of blood, presumably from her enemy post-battle, and this time I want her to be licking her finger talon instead to really draw the attention to it front and center as her weapon of choice. The goal of this step is to get a decent composition and a good feel for the personality of the movement. Ideally, I want to be able to feel the action from across the room. As long as the proportions and the bony landmarks on the body are right, I'm not going to worry too much about the little things for the moment. So after some hours of initial composing and refining, this is what we have. It's enough to convey some sense of movement and emotion, and nothing is egregiously wrong, so we can leave it for now and move on to the face, because that's where most of her personality is going to come from. With the old face, I honestly didn't have any real understanding of facial expressions at all. I just did what felt kind of like an evil laugh and just went with it. This time, I want to take that idea and turn it up to 11. I want this character to be experiencing pure, unabashed joy in the acts of slaughtering her enemies or the innocents or whatever, because she's obviously 100% team evil. Or is she? Actually, as I was sculpting this piece, her backstory started to develop, and maybe it's not all so simple as it appears, but suffice it to say, she is definitely not on team good guys. Let me know in the comments, actually, if you guys want me to go into some of the story behind my original characters. I usually just kind of gloss over it because I figured this is a sculpting video and not a storytelling video, but who knows, maybe it's more interesting than me talking about how I smooshed clay onto some armatures or whatever. Speaking of sculpting, for her expression, I'm loosely taking inspiration from a particular poster from the film American Psycho, where Christian Bale is laughing in apparent pure joy while covered in blood spatters. I'm not referencing it directly, just going by memory and using it as a starting point to develop this idea into its own thing. And once I feel like the face is in pretty good shape, I'm going to attach it to the body. Now, see what's happening here? How I'm attaching the head to the body only by shallowly sinking the support wire into the surface? This is a bad idea, and it's going to come back and bite me shortly. But for now, I'm moving on to her hair. If you recall, the original had long hair that was just one big giant chunk because I honestly didn't know how to make it any different at the time, but this time I want to lean into the fire theme, so I want to make her hair quite a bit shorter and a bit flame-like. Not to be like Super Saiyan hair or anything, but I want to lift the ends a bit and make those look a bit like tongues of flames. Another benefit this will give me is some visual coherency between the hair and the body. In a little bit, I'm going to put flames coming up all around her and all over her body, so I want every element of this piece to play well with each other. And can I just say, I actually really like sculpting faces and hair. It's a lot of fun to do this and watch a character go from Miss Baldy to having a stylish mane. I really like how this one turned out, the hair and the facial expression both. One small technical thing of note is that I'm leaving the frontmost hairpiece separate so I can have better access to her face later for painting and other adjustments. You'll see this piece come on and off throughout the video, and just want to let you know why that might be. After the hair is in place, I spent a bunch more time working on the body. Now I'm going to make a lot of very small adjustments that are pretty hard to show properly in a video like this, so rather than me describing all the little changes, I want to talk about two areas in particular: her left shoulder and her left hand. Take a look here. When your arm moves backwards like this, it's much more natural for you to rotate your shoulder in a little bit and point your biceps toward the torso. You can try this yourself. Try doing this pose and pay attention to what your shoulder is doing. You'll find that your entire arm will want to rotate inward from the shoulder. It's not impossible for you to go straight back and have your shoulder still be open, but it's really uncomfortable. It's a lot more natural for you to rotate your arm in a bit. The other thing that I changed was the position of her left hand. The previous pose was just a little too relaxed for me. This is not so much a technical anatomy thing, but it just felt funny to have most of her body be in such extremes of movement, but for her hand to be quite relaxed. So after some experimentation, I felt like a slight pushing motion felt more energetic and just joyful, like she's frolicking through the battlefields or something. Anyway, other than that, everything else got a slight touch-up, and soon we are ready for the first bake. But do you remember how I said just embedding the head support wire shallowly into her back was going to be a problem? Well, here it is. Basically, this clay, and I think other polymer clays too, gets soft before it gets hard. As the temperature in the oven rises, the clay gets weaker and weaker until it reaches a certain temperature where it hardens up. And because there was so little clay holding in the wire for the head, and the head was so heavy because of all that hair, it broke apart. Now, this is not as dramatic as it looks. The head is mostly intact. There are some small dents in the hair, and the face is completely fine. It's only the neck and the upper back that got serious damage. The fix is not particularly difficult. I removed any parts that were too broken up and drilled a hole through both the torso and the neck to insert a thicker wire through the middle. Then just resculpted the upper back and the neck and blended it all in. It really wasn't that bad once I got over the shock of seeing the lady's head falling off rolling around in the oven. The big lesson here, I think, is that bees putty needs to be properly supported when there's a large mass hanging off a relatively thin connector like big hair on a thin neck like this. Once I put that wire through the middle of the neck, there were no more issues. So all in all, a relatively small price to pay for a valuable lesson. And that's the body, face, and hair pretty much done. I'll continue to make tiny adjustments off camera, but this is like 99% there, so we can move on. Okay, the next thing I want to work on is the flames. I want to draw this curved line as if she's wearing a dress made of fire. I think it's a nice expansion of the original idea and could be more interesting compositionally. But when I got to working on it, it just didn't look right. The problem is I had attached a big piece of flame to her hip and didn't really integrate it any other way. To me, it just looked like she had a weird fluffy squirrel tail thing coming out of her hip, and it's just bizarre. So I messed with it and messed with it and messed with it. And look, if I told you the full story with all the different revisions and whatnot, it's going to take like 10 minutes. So let me just say that after a whole bunch of tries, I eventually ended up with this. She's got some big flames coming up from all around her in some weird and wacky supernatural ways, and some smaller flames coming up on her body as well. And yes, I know this looks like a pile of squishy clay and aluminum foil right now, but what I'm evaluating is the outline or the silhouette of the sculpture. Squint your eyes a bit and imagine this as a rough pencil sketch, and you'll have a pretty good idea of what's going through my head. Anyway, once I figured out the general shapes that I'm going for, I get into sculpting the flames, which goes something like this. First, I apply some lumps of clay to define where the little tongues of flames are going to be and add some round ovals in between some of them too. I'll tell you why in a second. Next, I push a little flame lumps around to make them more flamey shape and give the ovals a face. I decided that these magical flames needed some poor, unfortunate souls that are trapped in her magic flames. To be frank, I included these because I felt like the flames were never going to be realistic looking, so I decided to add an element that pushes it clear into magic land. Turns out I like them a lot, and I think it adds a lot of character to what otherwise would be pretty boring flames. After the initial shaping, I carved the flames with a fairly coarse rake to help refine the shapes of the flames further, and finally brushed the whole thing down with some 99% alcohol to clean up and blend away any clay fuzzies or rough edges, followed by some fixes and adjustments where necessary. Yeah, this is where the scope of the project got completely out of control. These flames more than doubled the length of the project, and what started out as a quick and fun playtest slash skill check turned into a massive endeavor that was way more complicated than what I signed up for. But I was committed to the idea and, rightly or wrongly, went with it. And that's two pieces done. Now I just have to do that to this one, this small one under here, and this tiny little one on her back foot. And just like that, 3 weeks of work has been reduced to about 3.5 minutes of YouTube time. Hooray! In the middle of all that, I also sculpted the flames on her body. I'm going back in time a little bit to show you how I did these. You actually just saw the completed version along with the base flames just now. In real life, I worked on all these parts kind of concurrently, but I felt like it made more sense to show you things in this order. Hopefully it's not too confusing. So this part is actually pretty easy because the body has already been baked hard. It's very easy to shape these flames directly against a hard surface. Not everything has to be a difficult battle, thank goodness. The design and flow of them was the hardest thing. I had to pay a lot of attention to how the flames affected the character's silhouette. If you put too much clay on her sides, for example, it can make her hips look narrower, and if you put too much around her knees, it can affect the apparent shape of her legs, etc., etc. In the best case, the flames enhance the flow of the anatomy, and hopefully in the worst case, they just do no harm. From a design point of view, I tried to strike a balance between the flames looking very fire-like versus being very flowery and vine-like. Again, I think this little spin adds to the character. Everything, including the flames on the base and on the body, are all helping to inform and develop the character in my mind. Ideally, everything works together in concert to tell a story about the character. Ultimately, I do like the way these flames look a lot, and if these were tattoos, I think they would look pretty amazing if I do say so myself. Lastly, we have her finger blade / talon thingy. Again, we're going back in time a bit to keep the thoughts organized for the video. I tried building this out of regular clay at first, but quickly found out that it's too thin to easily shape. Even after baking, it was still wiggling around the steel wire because it just didn't have enough mass to hold its shape well. So learning some lesson from my last attempt at making blades on Let Me Solo Her, I switched to epoxy, in this case Abe's Fix-It Sculpt for maximum temperature tolerance. Basically, I roughen the shape of the blade around a steel wire. Once it is cured, I then refine it using sandpaper. If you're doing the same, you must wear a respirator. You do not want to be breathing in fine epoxy dust. I'm wearing a mask, and I also have a HEPA air filter in the room, and I've opened the window. Next time, I'll probably do this next to my airbrush hood also. Safety first, guys. Sculpting is fun, but it's not worth dying over. After the blade has been shaped, I can sculpt the little transitional flames around it and her hand. Just like the hairpiece, I'm leaving the talon detachable and doing my best to sculpt around the seam so that it's not very visible. I want full access to her face for the painting. And that's the sculpting part done. I am super happy with the anatomy and the body flames. Not so much with the base flames. In retrospect, there was a stage during the base flame sketching that had just a few pieces on the ground that I thought looked great. But, I was just overcommitted to the idea. But all you can do is make the best decisions you can at the time that you make them and try to learn from your mistakes, right? In this case, the flames are probably a little bit much because I feel like they actually hide the girl a little too much. But, live and learn. Anyway, on to the painting. I'm gonna start with the flames, which might seem a little strange, but it'll make more sense this way, I promise. I've already primed the model using lacquer spray, so we can go ahead and jump right in, starting with white, followed by magenta. Yeah, see, when I added the little poor unfortunate souls to the flames, the idea occurred to me that I should make these not red. And I'll tell you a secret, I actually meant for these flames to go from white to magenta, then transition to a purple lilac color. In fact, the name that I had for this character was Queen of the Lilac Flames. But when I started spraying with magenta, I thought it looked fantastic, so I just went with it. She can be the queen of some other kind of flower that's pink. And maybe the flowery flames on her body makes more sense to you now. Anyway, I left the core of the flames white because I wanted that like white hot feeling, but after the first round of magenta, I felt like it needed a little bit more white between the little flamelets, so I applied some white oil paint, which worked okay. Conceptually, it seemed fine, but in practice, most of my oil paints that I had on hand were a bit too earthy in tones, and the transition from white to magenta felt a little dingy. But I'm nitpicking here. I think they look pretty good, especially considering that I'm figuring this out as I go. For the body, I'm building up some layers of skin tones with brighter colors coming from the bottom. What I'm trying to do is give a sense that the flames are emitting light. First, I tried a medium tone from top all the way down to a near white at the bottom. But next to the flames, it just looks kind of weird. All that pink should be casting a color, right? So then I went back and darkened up the top sides with a touch of darker and greener skin, followed by some pink coming from the bottom. My initial thought was that the white hot flames were just going to desaturate the very brightly lit skin all the way to white. Don't ask me why, I was overthinking it. Pink coming from the bottom looks a lot more convincing, as you can see here. Once the skin is done, we can move on to the body flames. I'm going to start by painting some liquid mask as close around the flames as I can. It's a bit hard to see because the stuff dries mostly translucent, but they're there. And yes, this is very tedious, but I'd say it's a lot less tedious than painting each flame individually, so this is fine. After the mask, I apply some tape in the larger areas and got spraying. Just like the flames on a base, I'm going from white transitioning through pink up to magenta. The airbrush makes this honestly a pretty damn easy job and totally makes the tedium of painting the mask worth it. The challenge here for me was how to know when I'm done, because I can't come back to this step without reapplying the mask, which I definitely don't want to do again, so I have to be super duper sure that what I'm doing is enough. Other than that, it's easy peasy. Oh yeah, and the separated talon needs some love too. After all that is done, I gently as I can peel off the mask, this time using some makeup sponges to assist, and it mostly worked. I was, however, unable to escape some small paint peels in the end. I really debated showing you this little boo-boo because if you saw my last video, you might remember that I had a devastating peel on that sculpture. But I've learned some things, and this time it's actually not that big of a deal. See, I had primed this model using lacquer spray, which is supposed to have a much stronger bond with the model than acrylic primer. And as you can see, that's mostly true. And I will talk about what I think went wrong in a minute, but what I can do now with lacquer is that I can just apply more primer with a brush. And because it's lacquer, it's sandable. I'm using Mr. Hobby Finishing Surfacer, and it's exactly meant for this kind of task. I dab on a few layers of this stuff, build it up so I can sand the edges smooth against the paint, respray the same colors, and the fix is basically invisible. What I think happened this time was that I failed to thoroughly clean the model before priming. And I think this because there are parts of this model that I did have to clean thoroughly for a different reason that we don't need to get into, and the lacquer bonded to those areas so completely that I can't even scratch it off with my nails if I tried. Once again, lesson learned. It looks a lot like I made the same mistake twice, but actually it's quite different this time, and I'm happy for the chance to learn how to fix a mistake like this under a circumstance where it's not project breaking. Next, I'm going to once again mask off the model, just the face and only with modeling tape this time because the chips on the body had me a bit spooked. Hey, I'm not that stupid to try a liquid mask again when I'm not 100% sure the face is cleaned off. Anyway, a bit of masking tape and cling film later, I spray the hair green. I really debated the color of her hair. I even took some photos and tried to Photoshop some options, but in the end, I decided that I want some color contrast in this piece because there was so much pink already. So first I did a deep green followed by a highlighting up to a lime green. I then sprayed the tips magenta because I wanted to make it look like the flames are coloring the hair as well. This is one area that I'm not super jazzed about. The transition between green and magenta is really dingy, and I think that's because they're basically opposite colors, so where the two colors meet, it feels really dull. I'm not sure how I should have done this, but if you're a painter, please do leave some tips in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what could have been done better here. For her face, this is obviously a very high detail area that's both intimidating and not that bad. First, I paint all the red areas red, like the insides of her mouth and the inner rims of the eyes, followed by the eyebrows, lips, and teeth, and then her actual eyes. It's really not that complicated actually, just get a nice sharp brush, don't drink too much coffee, and be careful. I decided not to give her irises because it just seemed too human for her to have them. I even tried to Photoshop some irises into test, but I just didn't like how normal it made her look. I felt like this character needed some level of a disconnect with us in order for her personality to work. Lastly, some pastels for literally makeup. I gave her green eyeshadows, some smoky eyes, a dark liner, and some contouring around the cheeks and her neck. In retrospect, the makeup might be just a little too heavy, but I don't mind. I think it works for her regardless. While I had the pastels out, I also shaded some of the recesses around her body, just to give it that little extra sense of depth. It's the details, guys. All right, everything is all painted. Now I just have to assemble the little hairpiece in front, the claw on her hand, and put her with the flames. Which brings me to the critical flaw of this piece. The flames. They don't look like flames. It's okay, I can admit that. The big problem here is that they don't emit light. And not only do they not emit light, they are going the opposite direction to real life. Light tends to come from above, at least in my house they do, and that means that natural light is actively fighting my sculpture. What is supposed to be dark is light, and what is supposed to be light is dark. But since I can't fix this with paint, I'm gonna cheat. With a light up base. I've cut out some MDF on a bias, and then I'm gonna glue them together to make a kind of an awkwardly thick picture frame. Since I'm not a woodworker, my angles were slightly off and I needed to fill them slightly with wood filler and sand it smooth. Then I'm going to glue together 2 pieces of polycarbonate to make a lid for this box. This is total overkill, by the way. I just wanted the thickness to hold the sculpture pegs up straight. It doesn't need to be this thick for strength, and acrylic would have done just fine. Once the lid dries, I take the whole pattern from the temporary base and drill them into the polycarbonate, peel off the protective paper, and yes, I know the glue job looks awful. That won't matter much after I sand it. I'm sanding it to basically frost the plastic so that the light coming from underneath would be nice and diffused. You can hand sand this or use a power sander if you got it, doesn't really matter. Back to the frame, I've sanded and spray painted it black. Sorry I didn't get that footage, but you're a smart cookie. You can figure out how I did that. I hot glue the lid on and it's time for the final assembly. And now maybe you're wondering, where's the light? Well, I'm not going to put a light in the box. I'm going to put the box on top of a nice bright film light. You'll see how it looks in a second. Anyway, when I put all the pieces back together and put the whole thing on top of that nice light I was talking about, it looks a little something like this. And that is it. What do you think, guys? How does 3 years of progress look? I gotta be real with you, I'm pretty happy with this one. This looks like a solid improvement over the original version. Are there things I'd change and improve about it? Of course, but I did my best and learned a bunch of stuff, so it's all good. Maybe in another 3 years I'll redo this character again and see how far the next 3 years will take me. But what do you think? Are the flames too much? Do you like the green hair? Go ahead and let it rip in the comments. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video interesting or at least diverting, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.